Welcome to, I think, one of a very interesting and, in my opinion, having heard Dr. Tellis before, a very, what shall we say, a very different approach to looking at what is going to happen to US-China relations and what the US is doing as far as this part of the world is concerned. Just to make a few brief things about Dr. Tellis. Everybody knows him as one of the main architects of this Indo-US nuclear deal, right? And he was certainly one of the major leading lights of this change in the relationship between India and the US that we are also seeing different facets of it currently. Okay. He has a very distinguished kind of career. He, of course, graduated from the University of Chicago, and from there he's had several elements of a very distinguished career. He was at the RAND Corporation for some time, and then from the RAND Corporation he moved into the formal government system. He spent a long time in Delhi at different times in his career, and as I said, he has been the architect of a lot of the improvements that we are seeing in the relationship between two natural allies, the United States and India. Apart from the nuclear deal, which I also knew him when we met at Berlin, and I particularly liked the way he kind of tried to present the different facets of a very complex relationship in a way in which we can actually easily relate to it. He is currently a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he specializes in international security, defense, and Asian strategic issues. But knowing him, I think he's a specialist in many other things than what he says here. He's actually pretty good at most things that you think you know, but you actually think he knows. When you talk to him, you find out that he knows these things much better than you. Okay, so it's a kind of very interesting exchange that you can have with him at that level. He, apart from all this, what I call the practical aspects related to not only diplomacy, but making things happen in the international arena, Dr. Tellis has actually done many other things, including publishing a lot of articles and in reputed journals. There are a lot of them, so we are not really going to talk too much about them. But I'd like to mention that he's actually written two important books. One is on India. It's called India's Emerging Nuclear Posture, authored in 2001. And the other one is about a country that is of great interest to India, which is also engaging a lot of us at NIAS, which is actually interpreting China's grand strategy, past, present, and future. I don't want to take too much time. I think Ashley will have a lot of things to tell you. So I'm going to hand over the floor to Ashley. And Ashley, please do. And thank you so much for coming here, taking time off from your very busy schedule. I'm sure you recognize a lot of your old friends here. So please, thank you very much for coming here and sharing some of your great knowledge with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chandra, for that very warm and generous introduction. I must confess that that is going to be a very expensive introduction. I will have to recompense Chandra well for having said all those very nice things about me. You are under no obligation to take any of them seriously, of course. I'm delighted to be here in Bangalore. This is a visit that I have come back to after almost 10 years, if memory serves me right. And it's remarkable to see how this city has changed in the 10 years since I last visited. Sometimes not always for the better, but it's great to be at NIAS. This is my first visit here. So I want to thank Professor Ramamurthy and the institution for inviting me. I've always watched the work done at NIAS with a certain degree of awe from a distance, because as I was telling the staff this afternoon, it's one of the few places that has attempted to do public policy analysis, integrating technical work. And many of the challenges that we face today are not simple challenges of public policy. They involve very detailed and recondite aspects of human knowledge. And it's wonderful to have an institution like this. It reminds me in so many ways of RAND, which is where I worked for many years, where you can bring together technical analysis and policy analysis together in the hope of better informing the choices we make. The subject that I'm going to speak on today is obviously somewhat removed from the kind of work that NIAS has focused on, but yet I think is very important for the future of both our countries, the United States and India. I'm going to talk today about the US effort that is underway to rebalance to Asia. And it's important because it goes to an issue of geopolitical context. It goes to the issue of what kind of geopolitical environment is going to exist in this part of the world in the years to come. And if we do not quite get that context right, then obviously the choices that it will impose on all the states that inhabit this region will obviously be far more difficult. And so understanding what the US is trying to do, I think at least is a useful first step in trying to assess what the future of the broad Indo-Pacific region is. And so I'm going to focus my remarks really on this subject, understanding the genesis, understanding the phenomenology, and the consequences of what the US rebalance to Asia entails. And let me start by trying to answer a very simple question. Why the rebalance in the first place? The best way to answer that is to go back and remind ourselves about a famous American 19th century bank robber named Willie Sutton, who after a series of very successful bank robberies was finally apprehended. And I suspect most bank robbers, was not a particularly great intellectual. So when he was apprehended and was asked by the arresting officer why he robbed banks, he very laconically said, because that's where the money is. And I think it's a rather nice way of trying to explain in a nutshell why the US is rebalancing to Asia. It's rebalancing to Asia because that's where the money is. It's where the action is in contemporary geopolitics. I don't need to remind any of you that if you look at the broad swath of particularly littoral Asia, the maritime dimensions of Asia, all the way from the northeast to the Indian subcontinent. I mean, this is a part of the world that is really going to be the new center of gravity in the international system. In this crescent is going to lie the productive motor of the global economy. In this crescent lie major nuclear weapon states. In this crescent lie still unresolved rivalries. And most important of all, the paradoxical reality that in this crescent we are going to see the intersection of 19th century balance of power struggles with 21st century patterns of economic integration. And how exactly we maneuver in this interaction of a 19th century world which continues to define politics and a 21st century world which continues to define geoeconomics is going to be the challenge for all countries involved in this region. But these facts have been known for a long time. I mean, since at least the early 1990s, it was obvious that the broad Indo-Pacific littorals were going to be where the future of the global system would be shaped, because there has been a steady shift of power from west to east. There's been a steady shift of productive base from the old Anglo-Saxon world to the new peripheries of Asia. And so it has been easy to forecast that this transformation was slowly in the making now for several decades. A transformation that paradoxically was brought about as a result of American investments in Asia in the aftermath of the Second World War. And I'm going to talk about that at some length. So why did it take us so long to rebalance? In 2012, that's when the first time the Obama administration announced that it was going to be intensifying its role. The United States was going to be intensifying its role in the Asia-Pacific in a way that it had not done before. And at that time, the then National Security Advisor, Mr. Tom Donilon, offered an explanation. And I'm going to quote the explanation verbatim. And he said the rebalance is ultimately oriented to making certain that international norms and law are respected, that commerce and freedom of navigation are not impeded, that emerging powers build trust with their neighbors, and their disagreements are resolved peacefully without threats or coercion. This was a very long explanation for the rebalance. I also think of this explanation as being a diplomatic explanation for the rebalance. It's a useful explanation, and every component of it has an element of truth which must be taken seriously. But I think it's a diplomatic way of illumining what is a somewhat undiplomatic reality. And that undiplomatic reality is that, if you use the language of Star Wars, the movie, there is a disturbance in the force. And that disturbance in the force is essentially caused by the fact that there has been, for many years now, and will continue for many years in the future, a transformation in the continental balance of power that potentially could have very significant disruptive impact. And that transformation in the continental balance of power has arisen because of the growth of a new state called China. Now, it's not that China is a new state. China has been around as a civilization for many thousands of years. It's not even the case that China is a new nation state in the Asian context. It has been around since at least 1949 in a modern incarnation. But it is certainly true that China is a new geopolitical force of consequence since at least the 1980s, since at least the latest revolution that has occurred in China's history, which was Deng Xiaoping's liberalization of the Chinese economy and its progressive integration with the world. This dramatic transformation that has been slowly working its way since 1978 has created in China a new power in the international system. If one had to ask oneself in 1978 whether there would come a time, barely within 30 years, that there would be a country that would have the second largest economy in the world, that would have military capabilities that are capable of challenging the United States, that would be a country that could potentially become a rival to the United States. If these questions were asked in 1978 of any US policymaker, I think the answer would have been a resounding no. In fact, I have argued in print that part of the reason the United States proceeded to integrate China into the global economy post-1978 was because of two divergent but complementary drivers. There was a liberal driver, and the liberal driver was the desire to expand the global economy, to expand the international system which had been so successful as a result of America's post-war investments. And so to that degree, there was a certain altruism in the concept. But there was also a calculation that even if this integration had occurred, there would be no fundamental transformation in the geopolitical balance at the central level. Because if the United States had understood in 1978 that what it was about to do would have created this fundamental geopolitical disruption, I'm not sure American policymakers would have pursued that policy of integration with great enthusiasm. They might have done so all the same out of absent-mindedness. There are many things that the United States does in fits of absent-mindedness. And so it is entirely possible we would have followed the policy, even if it was a completely counterproductive one. But if we had fullness of imagination and presence of mind, I'm sure we would have given it at least a second thought. But now all that is behind us. We have made the investments in Asia since 1945. We have created an international system in Asia which has sown the seeds of globalization. And through the seeds of globalization, we have created opportunities for an international division of labor on an extraordinary scale. And when these opportunities, which allowed for an international division of labor, were complemented by a very calculating, a very conscious strategy of power maximization, which was pursued by the Chinese leadership, you got exactly that outcome which very few in the United States anticipated in 1978. That is the rise of a new great power that is potentially a serious competitor to the United States in Asia and around the globe. Certainly by 2012, it became apparent to US policymakers that this disruption in the traditional geopolitical balances was well underway. And this disruption was having consequences that the United States would have to manage. And the biggest consequence that the US had to confront was the fact that its treaty allies in Asia, allies that it was committed to defending through a solemn international agreement, these allies were becoming increasingly nervous about the fact that the most important power center in their part of the world now did not exist far away, but literally at their own doorsteps. Even more consequentially, this new power that emerged at their own doorsteps increasingly was acquiring not simply the capability to threaten their own security, which would have been natural given the relative disparity in size between China and many of the countries on its periphery, but equally importantly, was acquiring the capabilities to prevent the United States from coming to the defense of its allies if it needed to in a crisis. And so for the first time since the height of the Cold War, the United States had to confront a reality that it had last confronted only at the high tide of competition with the Soviet Union. That is, there was now a power in Asia that had the capacity to decouple the United States from its alliance partners along the Asian periphery. And given this reality, the United States essentially had a choice of doing one or the other thing. One is to walk away and, in a sense, accept the fact that new geopolitical realities would prevent it from essentially underwriting the commitments, making good on the commitments that it had once upon a time accepted, or making certain that it could force a comeback, that it could do the things that were required to reassure its allies that they did not have to succumb to the rise of new Chinese power and could continue to rely on the United States as a durable security guarantor in Asia. This recognition actually had dawned on the United States long before 2012. And if you look, for example, at the pre-election speeches that were made by candidate George W. Bush before he was elected, you can see in those pre-election speeches a very clear recognition that there was a challenge that was emerging on the horizon, and that challenge that was emerging on the horizon was fundamentally a challenge revolving around the rise of China, and that the United States would have to come to terms with this challenge and find ways of managing it. And so in the first few months of the Bush administration, there was actually an effort made to do what a decade later would be called rebalancing. Unfortunately for the United States, the tragedy of 9/11 intervened. And what 9/11 did was that it distracted the United States from what was the central geopolitical challenge into managing what at the end of the day, in my view, still is a peripheral challenge. This is not to say that terrorism is a pleasant business. It is nasty at the best of times. And in India, one does not have to make this point with any emphasis, because there are very few countries in the world that have had to deal with the ravages of terrorism for as long as India has. But even you know that terrorism at the end of the day is not an existential threat. It's not a threat that calls into question the survival of the nation. Unless, of course, it is linked to things like weapons of mass destruction and so on and so forth. And yet the United States, because of the shock of 9/11, ended up in a global campaign against terrorism, which had many benefits. Among the most important benefits were, of course, the evisceration of Al-Qaeda and the campaign against radical Islam in many parts of the world. Those were all benefits. But unfortunately, it ended up in a campaign in Iraq whose effectiveness and its legitimacy were questionable. And at the end of the day, resulted in a significant expenditure of American blood and treasure that made us more incapable of dealing with this new emerging power that existed on the horizon. And so by the time President Obama comes into office, the United States begins to become more conscious that it has to go back to basics. And what does going back to basics mean? Going back to basics means continuing to invest in advancing the most important geopolitical objective that the United States has had in Asia since the Second World War. And that is preventing the rise of any regional hegemony in the Eurasian landmass. We fought a Cold War with the Soviet Union to prevent the Soviet Union from becoming that geopolitical hegemon in Eurasia. And there is absolutely no reason why the United States can treat China any differently if China is on the cusp of becoming such a regional hegemon. And so the rebalancing was really a strategic effort to go back to dealing with what are the fundamentals of our strategic situation. And this rebalancing brings to the fore many components that need to be kept in mind. First, it is evidence of the American recognition that China's rise is an enduring rise. That it's not a flash in the pan. It's not something that is suddenly going to disappear and take care of itself because of some internal crises. China will have internal crises and there will be a series of internal challenges. But I think there is a broad judgment that the Chinese state has enough resilience that it can deal with those challenges and still begin to ascend as a major player in the international system. There's a second element that the rebalancing conveys, and that is that the objective of managing China's rise is going to be an extremely challenging one. It's going to be an extremely challenging one because it requires the United States to socialize China, to integrate China, to deter China, and to reassure China all simultaneously. This is going to be a very complex task and very different from the challenge that we faced with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union and dealing with the Soviet Union was difficult in practical terms because the Soviet Union was a formidable military power. And it was also an ambitious military power. But in logical terms, it was a simple challenge. It was a simple challenge because the United States and the Soviet Union shared absolutely no interconnectivity except in the security arena. In the security arena, we were tightly interdependent. What the Soviets did impacted us. What we did impacted the Soviet Union. But there were absolutely no other ties that tied the Soviet Union and the United States. There were no civilizational ties, there were no social ties, there were no economic ties. And so, we could afford to treat competition with the Soviet Union as a simple zero-sum game. And in a zero-sum game, you know exactly what the Nash equilibrium is. Now, it may be hard to implement the strategies required by that equilibrium, but the equilibrium is a very simple one. You know what you have to do. And so, as the historical record now shows, the United States did much better at this strategy than it itself had anticipated. I never forget a conversation I had with my colleague Zalmay Khalilzad, who was the senior director for Afghanistan at the time of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the first event that precipitated the crisis in 1979. And as you know, the Reagan administration, when it came into office, mounted this major campaign to roll back this invasion of Afghanistan. And the strategy was to, of course, arm the Afghans, the indigenous Afghan tribes, to fight this war with Saudi support and the support of many of the Islamic countries. And towards the end of that campaign, the United States made a very monumental decision which turned the course of that war. And that decision was to arm the Afghan rebels with Stingers. And when that decision was made, essentially Soviet air power superiority in Afghanistan disappeared. And once Soviet air power superiority in Afghanistan disappeared, then essentially Soviet forces could be chopped up piecemeal by the insurgency. And I asked Zalmay many years later, because we were both at the RAND Corporation together, and I asked him, I said, why did you make this decision? Because it was such a fraught and risky decision. Because we all now know in retrospect what happened as a result of those choices. And he said, we made that decision because we never believed that the Soviet Union would leave Afghanistan. And we never believed that the Soviet Union would ever collapse. We all imagined that this was going to be a 1,000-year struggle against Soviet power. And so even the United States was surprised by the success of its own Cold War strategy. And of course, even more so that when Soviet collapse occurred, it occurred relatively peacefully without a major global conflagration, which is what we prepared for. China is going to be an entirely different challenge. And China is going to be a different challenge because even as we compete with China in geopolitical terms and in military terms, we are deeply intertwined with China in economic terms. And so the problem of how do you go to war with your own banker takes on an entirely different complexion, where even as you are competing with this country, you are helping this country grow, just as the economic ties that link you are helping your own growth. And so what does competition mean in an environment where Chinese actions are contributing to American wealth and welfare, and American economic actions and ties with China are contributing to Chinese wealth and welfare? How do you compete in an environment where you are tied so deeply in economic terms and yet are geopolitical rivals? The last time we saw such a development in international history was about the time of the First World War, when Great Britain and Germany were tied economically even while they were slugging it out on the battlefields of Europe. And if you think interdependence at that time was significant, think how much deeper interdependence is today between the United States and China. And so the complexity of our challenge is really significant and serious. And it occurs at a point where, despite this complexity, there is a growth in Chinese power, which is causing a disequilibrium in the region, which is putting our allies in a position where they are anxious and demand even greater American support. And yet, even our allies do not have the appetite for supporting what would otherwise be the default American strategy for dealing with China, which is containment. Containment would be the default strategy if you see a rising China who could potentially be a competitor. And containment, unfortunately, is infeasible and impossible to implement. It's infeasible because it would mean that we have to cut off our own economic links with China. Go back to the kind of economic relationship we had with the Soviet Union, which was essentially non-existent. No American ally in Asia wants to be in a situation where the United States cuts off economic links with China, nor do they want to be in a position where the United States compels them to cut off economic links with China. So we now have a peculiar difficulty where our allies do want us to defend them against Chinese depredations, but they do not want us to do anything that will put at risk what are very productive economic linkages that the allies enjoy with China or which the United States enjoys with China. So given that containment is essentially off the table, we have to come up with essentially a new strategy. And that is what the effort of rebalancing is about. It's an effort to pull together a new strategic solution that satisfies both the economic demands of interdependence while protecting ourselves against the geopolitical risks that are associated with China's rise. In that sense, this effort at rebalancing shares a continuity with a long-standing US policy of preserving Asia whole and free. But there are three important twists to the new strategy. The first twist is that the United States at least has the ambition of developing an integrated strategy that is both diplomatic and economic, as well as military, while making the Asia-Pacific the centerpiece of US global strategy writ large. This is new. In the old days, yes, we had integrated strategies, or at least we tried to have them, but the geopolitical focus was Europe. That has changed as a result of rebalancing. The second is that the administration is making the effort to expand the concept of the Asia-Pacific to include the Indian Ocean. Because everyone recognizes that a successful rebalancing to Asia cannot occur if India is not part of the equation. Now, what that means in practical terms still has to be negotiated. And as someone who's had the pleasure of negotiating a civil nuclear agreement with India, I can tell you it will neither be quick nor will it be easy. But all the same, to exclude India from the definition of rebalancing would be catastrophic from the point of view of American interests. And so the second twist to the strategy of rebalancing is to expand what was traditionally a zone of American interest, which was the Asia-Pacific, to include the Indian Ocean, in order to bring India into this equation as well. And the third twist is a narrow military focus on ensuring that the United States will be able to put in place the capabilities to defeat any effort to deny the US freedom to project power. Because there is an understanding that if any adversary acquires the capabilities to deny us the freedom to project power, then essentially the rebalancing is over. Because we will not be able to deter China from misbehaving, nor will we be able to reassure our allies that they will be protected essentially by the United States. So in practical terms, what will the rebalancing involve? It involves three components. The first component is strategic, and that is the component that has acquired a lot of attention in the public discourse. There are many dimensions to the strategic component, but the most important thing you have to think about in the strategic component is the intention of the United States to maintain the requisite military capabilities in the region for purposes of deterrence and reassurance, along with preserving the requisite military capabilities over the horizon, capable of entering the region when required under conditions of necessity. That's the germ of the strategic component of rebalancing. And it manifests itself in different ways, and I'll just tick off some of those ways so that you can get a sense of what the effort involves. First, it's an effort to increase and diversify the kind of military presence that we have in Asia. The United States is no longer in the business of building new bases in the Asia Pacific. In a world of the revolution in military affairs, the idea that anything fixed will be sacrosanct is an idea from the past. So setting out to build new, large, fixed military bases is something that the United States will not make major investments in. Rather, what it wants to do is maintain a very flexible network of presence, where it is constantly visible, where it is constantly engaging with all the littoral powers of the region, constantly visiting the region, constantly deploying with indigenous states, constantly engaging in military activities in order to build up this network that can help shape China's choices. So to that end, the United States is focused on maintaining new naval forces or new naval force components, for example, in Singapore. There will be a modest marine presence in Darwin. There is an effort being made to look at Perth as a host station for new US capabilities. Guam, the island of Guam, is going to be the centerpiece for a very significant forward military presence in Asia. So presence is going to be key, but it's not presence tied to old Cold War style bases. It's presence everywhere in flexible form. The second element is developing counter-access capabilities. As all of you who follow the Chinese military know, that China has made significant investments in what is called anti-access and area denial. The United States wants to be able to neutralize these capabilities and operate as close as is necessary to the shores of the Asia Pacific without putting its own assets at risk. And there are a whole range of efforts ranging from technology to doctrines to new concepts of operations that are being explored in order to be able to deliver on this task. Third element is force restructuring. For the foreseeable future, the US Navy and the US Air Force will continue to enjoy far greater priority than the land components in the US military. Because everyone knows that the Indo-Pacific is a maritime theater. The era of long land wars in Asia, I don't want to say are over, because every time I say they're over, there's always one land war that pops us to surprise us. But at least if the United States can help it, the US will avoid engaging in long land campaigns of the kind that it engaged in Afghanistan and Iraq. Instead, it will focus on expeditionary capabilities. And expeditionary capabilities are essentially naval and air power. And last, it's going to focus on improving partner capabilities. The single best investment that the United States can make outside of recapitalizing its own military is to build up the capabilities of its friends and allies in Asia. Because the strategic calculus is a very simple one. The stronger the powers of countries that exist on China's periphery is, the more limited is China's ability to misuse its power. And so investing in partner capabilities of all our friends and allies is a very important dimension of the strategic element. Then there is the diplomatic, which is the second prong of the rebalancing strategy. The diplomatic engagement is going to be an engagement that is going to focus essentially on subtlety. The United States is going to be present in every multilateral forum in Asia that welcomes it. So it is not going to make invidious judgments about Asian fora as it did in the past, where some organizations were dismissed as being talk shops and therefore unworthy of US attention and interest. Even if they are talk shops, the US has concluded that it is worth being present at the talking. And so you will find a very concerted effort to stay engaged in all the multilateral fora in a very concerted way. Because this is part of the reassurance mechanism, it's also part of the shaping mechanism. It allows us to make certain that what happens in these multilateral fora, do not redound adversely to our own interests. Second, we are going to walk a tightrope. And the tightrope is going to be deepening our alliances and strategic partnerships on one hand, while also doing whatever we can to improve our relations with China. Remember, the key in managing the rebalance successfully is to do exactly the opposite of what containment required. Containment required the isolation of your adversaries. Containment required making certain that you had absolutely no ties with your competitors. The rebalancing is going to involve an entirely different approach. The United States will continue to stay engaged with China because it has no choice. Economic engagement, political engagement, engagement in every issue area, in every forum, is inevitable. But even as that engagement deepens, and hopefully for the better, the US is going to continue to hedge by deepening its alliance relationships with its friends and partners. Because the idea is to essentially smother China with kindness. And if you can pull that off, then we will have really achieved something that is going to be of enormous significance. And so the US it's very important to recognize this, that the US is not looking for a new fight with China. When people talk of the rebalancing, they tend to think of the rebalancing through the metaphors of the Cold War. And they think of it as essentially a closet strategy, a devious strategy of containing the Chinese. Nothing could be further from the truth. I think the United States has long recognized that the containment horse has left the barn. When you have trade with China at the levels that currently exist between the United States and China, containment is no longer an option. So we have to engage China. But we cannot be Pollyannish in terms of our engagement. We always have to recognize that even as we deepen ties with China, and even as we hope that those deepened ties will induce China into behaving responsibly, we always have to prepare for those contingencies when our best hopes may not be realized. And so part of preparing for those contingencies will be to build up our partnerships with key states in Asia. And there are a very small number of key states who fit this definition. Japan is an obvious one. Korea is an obvious one. Taiwan, to the degree that they want a relationship with the United States, is an obvious one. India is an obvious one. Singapore is an obvious one, and possibly Australia. So there will be a very concerted effort that the United States makes to develop its relations with these countries. And the third element of the diplomatic prong is to focus on developing a new set of norms. A new set of norms with respect to how interstate behavior is to be conducted. And the principal component of this new set of norms is going to be an effort to emphasize the need to resolve disputes without recourse to force. Whether it be maritime disputes in the South and East China Sea, whether it be continental disputes over borders, the principle that the US would like to see enshrined is that force not be used to resolve these disputes. The third prong is economic. And in many ways, this is an extremely important prong. What the United States is attempting to do with respect to economics is twofold. It is attempting at one level to expand the global multilateral trading system, which is centered on the WTO. Because in many ways, this is America's best and most glorious baby. This is the product that was begotten as a result of American power in the post-war period. And the creation of the global multilateral trading system has brought enormous benefits to a large number of countries worldwide. But the US is very conscious that it is going to be harder and harder to expand the global trading system as it did in the past. Because the new nations that are entering the global trading system are at a very different level of development compared to the mature powers that already exist in the system. And so the US has to confront what is a difficult proposition, which is how do you create a global multilateral system with a uniform set of rules when you have two different sets of countries that are involved in a common interaction. One set of countries that are capital rich and developed, and another set of countries that are capital poor and underdeveloped. How do you create uniform rules? Now, the problem is you can create uniform rules, but the quality of those rules will be extremely meager. Because when you are trying to reconcile interests between two groups of countries that have such disparity, the only rule that satisfies both is a lowest common denominator rule. And so, yes, we will be able to expand the global multilateral trading system. But the marginal gains made in that expansion will be extremely modest and extremely meager. And if you follow the debates in the WTO over the last several years, you know how difficult it is to be able to move even a few inches with respect to creating this global consensus. And so the United States has now embarked on a strategy that is potentially very rewarding, but also incurs extremely high risk. And that is, it is seeking to supplement the global expansion of the trading regime with new preferential free trade agreements with its partners. And the idea is a very simple one. The idea is, if you cannot expand the global multilateral system at the levels that you want, create subset agreements with partners that are mutually compatible. And if you can create high quality trading agreements between these partners, what you hope you will get are higher gains from trade, from the trade that takes place within these preferential trading agreements. And so the United States is focused very heavily on two preferential trading agreements in opposite parts of the world. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, which involves 11 Asia-Pacific countries, and the US-EU free trade agreement, which essentially will integrate the EU economies and the United States. And of course, there is a third area which doesn't get as much attention as it should, and that is revitalizing the entire North America free trade area, NAFTA, because that is still the most productive center of global trade in the system. Now, what are the benefits and what are the risks? The benefits are that the gains from trade would be potentially much higher for us if we were able to liberalize trade among countries that had comparable per capita incomes to ourselves. So if we could get the Japanese to open their markets and so on and so forth, the gains from trade would be much higher for us than trading, for example, with, say, Africa. What is the risk? The risk is that we could end up creating a set of segmented arrangements that over a period of time results in the progressive atrophy of the global multilateral trading system. Because if countries that become part of these preferential free trade agreements begin to sense that the gains from trade are greater for them from the preferential agreements, then they will have less and less incentive to invest in expanding the global multilateral regime. And so you could end up paradoxically in a situation where, if we are not careful, the United States could end up destroying the proudest contribution it has made to global integration since the Second World War. But at this stage, US policymakers feel they have no choice, that the need to compete with China is so strong, and the need to increase the relative gains that the United States gets from trade is so important that we are willing to consider preferential free trade agreements, at least as supplements, if not substitutes, for a global trading system. Now, these are the three components that the administration has discussed when it talks of rebalancing. And the idea at the end of the day is a very simple one. If all three components work as planned, the United States will begin to do much better than it did before in economic terms. That improved wealth and welfare performance will translate in greater resources available to the American state with respect to national defense. And those marginal increases in defense capability will contribute to both defeating Chinese efforts to prevent us from being able to operate in Asia, while simultaneously reassuring our friends and allies. That, in a nutshell, is the logic of the strategy. There are two other components, though, that don't receive as much attention when people talk about the rebalancing. And those are things that have to be kept in mind. First is the revitalization of the US economy itself. I have always believed that the success or failure of the rebalancing will depend less on what we do abroad and much more on what we do at home. It is entirely possible that if we are not smart, we could end up being very successful with respect to our external initiatives and being extremely dumb and short-sighted with respect to the choices we have to make at home. And there is no power in history that has actually survived as a great power simply on the strength of external achievements if they come increasingly at the cost of internal weakness and domestic innovation. And all you have to do is to look essentially at the trajectory of British power from about 1870 after, to recognize that even though the empire's glories were still seen in very coruscating ways until 1914, that was actually a shadow that was obscuring what was the complete weakening of the British economy as a result of the mismanagement of British power. There's a second component which also does not receive as much attention in the rebalancing, and that is, will the United States be able to enforce a certain degree of institutional coherence within its own state? It's nice to have a strategy, but at the end of the day, the strategy has to be implemented. And to be able to implement a strategy requires you to have institutional and organizational coherence. The right hand must know what the left hand is doing. It must at least know what the left hand and the right hand seek to do. The United States is such a complicated society and an even more complicated government, which by design has built up a system of divided sovereignty, that it would not be surprising to me if we do not manage to force the necessary institutional coherence that is required for success. And so this is something that US policymakers have to spend a lot more attention than they actually do. Let me end by saying a few words about the risks that are inherent in each of those three prongs of the rebalancing strategy. The biggest risk to the strategic component that I outlined, to my mind at this stage, is financial. That the US economy will have to pull out of the slump that it has experienced now for the last several years and go back to being a part of a high growth economy. Now, the bad news is that the pulling out of the slump has been much slower than anyone would like. The good news is that the United States has come out of slumps before and has the capacity to come out of the slump again. In fact, if you look at US economic growth in the last 2 quarters, it has been absolutely astounding. I mean, for a mature economy to be growing at plus 3% is quite remarkable. And so there is reason to hope that if we can get our dysfunctional domestic politics in order, we might be able to reach an agreement that puts our public finances in the right track, and then use those rebuilt public finances to make a comeback. The United States still has tremendous advantages as an innovation society. If you look at the disruptive innovations that are out there on the horizon, every one of them is an American innovation. And so the capacity of the United States to generate what economists would call Schumpeterian revolutions, that are disruptive revolutions that really transform the nature of the economy. The United States has that capacity better than any other nation. And so the hope is that over a period of time, if the United States gets its act together in terms of its public finances, in terms of creating a national consensus on where it wants to go, manage the dysfunctionality in its politics, it can begin to put the pieces back together. But victory is not assured, and this remains a very serious challenge. It's that we have not seen the last word has not been said. On the diplomatic, managing a partnership with China and with your partners simultaneously is going to test the skills of the best magicians you can summon in the diplomatic space. There is always a certain degree of tension. The closer you come to China, the more you unnerve your partners. The closer you come to your partners, the more you unnerve China. There is no magic algorithm which allows you to figure out what the optimal solution is. Rather, you find the optimal solution only in the doing. You have to grope towards a solution. And when you have to grope towards a solution, obviously there's no assurance that you will end up along the path that is the most productive. But the US has no choice. So on the diplomatic challenge, the real issue is going to be, can the United States do this tightrope walk with the adroitness that it requires for success? Remember, this is a multiplayer game. There is a US relationship with China. There is a US relationship with the partners. There is a relationship between the partners and China. There is a relationship between the partners and one another. And some of our partners actually don't happen to like each other. So that means that the US has to manage that element of the partnership too. And so whether we will be able to kind of have the sophistication and the skill to pull this off, again, remains another area that, where success is not certain. The third is the last question of the economic. As I said before, the question of whether the US economy will make a comeback is, to my mind, I have a lot more confidence on that question. The US economy will make a comeback. What I am less certain about is whether the strategy of preferential FTAs will yield the rewards that we are looking to yield. I hope they do. If they do, it will certainly be important to us. But I'm not sure as yet, because in many of these FTAs, the diversity of the countries that we are negotiating with is so great that if there is not sufficient political will, you can end up getting a very low-grade agreement, which is just as bad as the agreements you are likely to get in the global system. And so all the efforts you make into getting preferential FTAs may not be worth it. So that is a risk, again, that we have to see how it all works out. And then, of course, there is that huge question of, even if the preferential FTA is successful, have you then hammered one more nail into the coffin of the global multilateral regime? And what does that mean for the future of global integration? But the success of this strategy is still quite uncertain. And that has significant implications. If the United States fails, then the Indo-Pacific region essentially is likely to see the rise of a new ordering principle. it will move closer towards a cynic-dominated world, a world that centers on China. And the implications for many of the countries on China's periphery are significant. And so for countries like India, for countries like Japan, for countries like Korea, Australia, that are large nations that have proud histories and seek independent destinies, for countries like that, the success of the US rebalancing is vital. Because it is not yet clear to me that these countries have the capacity, either individually or in collaboration, to balance China independently. If they were, then the worst fears that the United States would have with respect to Asia, those worst fears would be attenuated. But until the point where countries like Japan, India, Australia muster the resources to assure themselves and to produce the positive externality of a balance of power for us, until that point, the best alternative for this part of the world, at least from the way I think about it, is for the US rebalancing to be successful. And so let me end on that note, because I think that captures succinctly the stake that we all collectively have in this endeavor. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Dr. Tellis for very, very, as usual, a very eloquent and a very fascinating presentation of a very complex problem. Thank you very much for that. We will take a few questions, so the floor is open.
Thank you, Dr. Tellis. Dr. Venkat from St. Joseph's College. I teach at the Department of Political Science. In the context of what you've said just now, what sort of a role do you envisage for India in this particular strategy? Thank you.
I think there is a desired role and there is a feasible role. And the US desired role is that India becomes a close and active partner of the United States. I think that's the desired role. And if you look at the speeches that US officials have made now for about a decade, if not longer, there is a recognition that India will never be a formal ally of the United States. I don't think anyone has an illusion that that is a likely possibility. I also don't think that the United States wants to invest in pursuing that goal, because we can reach our objectives just as well without a formal alliance. But the desired objective, I think, is a close partnership, which involves cooperation in a range of areas, particularly the geopolitical areas. Now, what's the challenge? The challenge is that we essentially end up in a tripolar game between India, China, and the United States. And India, while it seeks the benefits of the American deterrence of China, does not want to position itself in a way where it is seen as bandwagoning with the United States against China. Right? So in that sense, the Indian predicament is identical to the predicament of all our Asian allies. Now, we have to find a way of cutting this Gordian knot. Because if India emphasizes the desire to avoid bandwagoning so much that effective balancing is impossible, then essentially what you've done is you've ceded the ground to China. Because that's essentially what, if I were in Beijing, I would want. I would want India to be so emphatic about opposing bandwagoning that essentially the prospect of a balancing coalition dissolves. And then my freedom of action increases. So in practical terms, what is the best achievable outcome? I think the best achievable outcome for both India and the United States is a policy of strategic coordination, where India can continue to pursue an independent foreign policy. But as long as that independent foreign policy keeps US interests and India's own interests within the field of view of its vision, and looks for opportunities to forge the partnerships wherever those partnerships are possible, I think we'll end up in a good place. So I keep telling my colleagues who think about these questions that if I were to rank order American preferences as a non-official, my first order preference, of course, would be that India becomes a formal ally. But that's not happening, so scratch that one out. My next order preference would be that India collaborate with me wherever possible outside of an alliance relationship. And I'm willing to make that happen by doing whatever is necessary at my end, which is why we pursued the civilian nuclear agreement and so on and so forth. But there is a third order objective. My third order objective is that even if India does not do the second, I hope India becomes strong enough that it is able to give the Chinese pause. Because if it is able to give the Chinese pause, then what India has created is a positive externality that I can exploit. And of course, the fourth order preference is that India kind of bandwagon with China, but that we obviously don't want, so we scratch that one out too. Now, what worries me is that I find myself in an uncomfortable position where I'm never going to get one. We are all agreed on that, right? There is tremendous diffidence in India about two. Even in areas where we can work together, there are a whole series of problems at your end and at our end that prevent that from happening. And then what gives me sleepless nights is option 3. India is one of those few great powers that goes out of its way to shoot itself in the foot every chance it gets. And so if you are not going to give me the satisfaction of 2, at least give me the satisfaction of 3. Go out and become a great power on your own terms, because that is in my interest. And now I have 2 presidents, one Republican and one Democrat, who have emphasized the same principle, that India's rise as a great power is in America's interest, whether you are a partner of ours or not. And we love you to be a partner, but even if you're not, become a great power in your own terms. And this is where it worries me, because when I see India floundering on so many issues of public policy, it means that that strength that I need for my security, and this is not an act of altruism, okay? I'm thinking about American interests here. You are frustrating American interests by not becoming as strong as you can be. I mean, that's the long and short of it.
Ashley, terrific speech. This is a comment from your left side, so I just want to forewarn you. Couple of things. You concluded with the statement that U.S. Actions or intentions are noble. I think a lot of people would disagree with that, especially given the role of the U.S. in the post-Second War. You look at Vietnam, you look at support of military dictatorships all over Asia, its role during the Bangladesh War, and so forth. So it may be changing now given the Chinese rise. So I have reservation about that. The other one, which sort of follows from that, is a very important thing you mentioned, is that one of the parts of the rebalance is a change of norms, which is that disputes have to be settled through non-military or without use of force. Now, U.S. is hardly in a position to say something like that, given what we have just experienced in the last 2 decades. So is this a fundamental rethink in the U.S. military, that we really want to have no war with China? Or because more you get caught with rebalance, with ships and other things, the chance of triggering something becomes easier?
Good points. Let me address both. When I was talking of the nobility of US intentions, I'm not talking of US policy writ large. I mean, it is perfectly understandable if people abroad are skeptical about the nobility of our aims. Remember, the United States is not in the business of doing good in the first instance. The United States is in the business of advancing its interests in the first instance. To the degree that good comes out of that, I think of that as a beneficial thing to be welcomed, right? But no US policymaker can make it his life's mission to do good for the world, right? You have to start by doing good for yourself. And if in the process you do good to others, well and good. I was talking of the nobility of our intentions with respect to the rebalancing. And that is the effort at rebalancing is aimed at essentially creating an environment that is conducive to the interests of our friends and ourselves. That's what I meant by nobility. So it's in a very narrow form. Do the Chinese have the same view? I suspect not, right? If you are in Beijing, you're not going to think of American intentions in the rebalance as being particularly noble. Even though if they were to think about it for a minute, if we did not rebalance successfully, there would be very serious consequences for China itself. But I'm not going to sit down to educate the Politburo about what their interests are. On the larger question about the use of force, you're absolutely right. The United States is not about to renounce the use of force and will use force when it suits its interests. But it has an interest in making certain that other states don't do the same. And particularly insofar as the use of force by other states invokes American responses of force, we want to be very cautious about those circumstances. So we want to be careful about a Chinese use of force against Japan that would then precipitate an American use of force in East Asia. We want to be careful about a North Korean use of force against South Korea that precipitates us from coming in. So when I'm talking of the US effort to inculcate a norm, it's a norm that is a very limited norm in a very specific circumstance and driven fundamentally by the objectives of my own self-interest. So if you were to come to me and say, why don't you apply this wonderful norm to yourself? My response to you will be, thank you very much. I'm going to do exactly what suits my interests in doing so. So this is a perspective that is very much from the interests of the United States. The only argument I would make to qualify that is to say that this also happens to be a norm that is in the interests of many other powers of Asia. Right? So it's not simply a unilateral US interest to have a situation in Asia where states don't use force against each other. In fact, you run into some very interesting paradoxes here, because if we were to unilaterally renounce the use of force, there would be no way in which we can ensure our extended deterrence guarantees. And if we renounce those extended deterrence guarantees would not even exist to begin with. And if the extended deterrence guarantees didn't exist to begin with, the nature of competition in the Asia-Pacific would take on very different forms. So you get into all kinds of paradoxes of rationality when you think about this problem. So don't ask me to give up the use of force.
Is it a conscious decision you've taken to leave out the Russians from this equation, also Vietnam, considering both countries have very good, especially in relation to India. When you're talking about India and its, you feel its inability to reach out on its own. So India has some options, which I think maybe you may like to offer your comments.
Vietnam and Russia, I think, are in two different categories from the point of view of the rebalancing. And from the point of view of rebalancing, Vietnam is very important. But again, it's a tightrope walk. The United States wants to support Vietnam in its effort to protect its own interests, but we do not want to support any state to the point where they engage in provocations that end up in inadvertent conflicts that obviously implicate the United States. But Vietnam is very clearly seen as potentially a state that would be part of this vision. Russia is a different problem. I think the United States deeply yearns for a new relationship with Russia. Unfortunately, we cannot seem to find the formula for making that happen in practical terms. And part of it, I think, has to do with the choices and the worldview of the current Russian leadership, which is very focused on a competition with the United States for reasons that have to do with its own internal interests rather than anything else. Because when you look today objectively at US-Russian relations, there is no objective collision of interests. I mean, Russia does not challenge the United States in a way that the Soviet Union did. There is no reason why the Russians should feel overly concerned by the US regional missile defense plans, for example. I mean, we have sat down on so many occasions with our Russian counterparts and demonstrated that the kinds of capabilities that are being deployed under the European phased adaptive system are capabilities that simply cannot stop Russian long-range missiles. I mean, we've done the arithmetic, we've shown them the graphs and all that stuff. But, and I think, Russians who understand the physics and the engineering of this stuff understand this too. But their political leaders have seized on this as an opportunity to argue that the United States is attempting to push Russia into a corner. And of course, then there are other problems that one has with Russia, mostly with respect to Russian internal governance. So the Russian attack on what were the liberalizing forces in its own society, the kind of repression that has begun over ideas in the last few years, and so on and so forth. So I think most American policymakers would love to see Russia become part of a rebalancing in Asia, where we have a productive relationship with Russia. But I am pessimistic that we will be able to get such a relationship as long as, the current leadership in Russia is in place.
Thank you, sir. My name is Azhar and I am a student of St. Joseph's College. Sir, as you had said that if United States doesn't succeed in rebalancing, there will be a new rise of power, which is of course China, sir. So is US attempting the pivot because the US is feeling threatened because of the rise of China, sir?
Well, the short answer is yes. But it's not the US alone. Remember, at the end of the day, the United States is very far away. There are many other countries that lie between China and the United States. And there are many other countries that would be threatened far more quickly by Chinese power than the United States would be. And so when the US thinks about rebalancing, it's not just thinking of itself, even though it cannot not think of itself, but it's also thinking about countries on China's periphery with whom it has treaty obligations. And in the first instance, that is what has motivated the rebalancing. It's Japanese anxiety, it's Korean anxiety, it's the anxieties in Southeast Asia. It's even Indian anxieties about what China's rise means for regional security. But when all is said and done, part of the problem that the United States has today is that it cannot make up its mind about what the appropriate attitude to rising Chinese power ought to be. It cannot make up its mind. Because there are liberals in the United States who deeply believe that interdependence will essentially eliminate the worst of geopolitical competition. And so people will tell you with, clean consciences and very good reason that you shouldn't worry too much about the rise of China because at the end of the day, they're going to become a normal nation like everybody else and we will all live happily ever after because, the bonds of commerce will be so deep and enduring that we don't have to worry. But then there are, Neanderthals like myself who can't get it out of our heads that once countries become strong, they also have expansive interests and they start acting on those expansive interests. And sometimes when they act on their expansive interests, those undermine my own. And I don't have to look far to find examples of this. All I have to do is look at my own country. If you look at how the United States grew in power from 1776 until 1945, I mean, it is a story of expansion, material expansion, which then gives rise to a political expansion, which starts in the Western Hemisphere and then goes all over the globe. Now, why would the Chinese be the exception to this rule? So at some point, there is an irreducible tension in our interests. And, that leaves the United States, I think, with no choice but to start seriously thinking about what it needs to do. Now, the best thing we can do in this circumstance is not to think about containment, because I think China is not there yet. It's not warranted as a strategy. And it would be a very costly strategy for us because of economic interdependence. So you have to think of strategies that are a lot more subtle, strategies that are a lot more mixed. And that's really what the rebalancing is. It's a strategy of deepening integration while hedging simultaneously.
Two of the cardinal points in the US stated foreign policy have been promotion of human rights and promotion of democracy. But the US record in this around the world does not support this view. The support has been to authoritarian relationships, which have totally disregarded both these. I'd like your comments on this.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the United States has a declaratory policy. And part of that declaratory policy is to promote democracy, to promote human rights, to essentially promote a liberal order, right? You're talking of a liberal order. And that is important because I think American policymakers are strongly convinced that the more resilient the liberal order is worldwide, the safer the international system is for American interests. I mean, that's the theory, right? But in practice, every nation ends up with very uncomfortable situations where it has to compromise its principles. It happens all the time, right? I mean, Indian foreign policy is no exception. You end up, I think, pursuing your interests first. And if your interests take you in the direction of having to occasionally sup with the devil, you find ways of helping your conscience come to terms with that compromise. Until the circumstances change objectively and you can move to a different course of action. There is a wonderful line in the dedication that Machiavelli writes in The Prince, where he talks about the need to take your bearings from republics that are not imagined, but from republics as they actually are. And this is a continual tension in the foreign policies of all liberal states, right? You always want to shape your foreign policy to accord with your highest ideals. But you discover that if you actually have to implement a policy based on your highest ideals, you're not only going to lose your wallet, you'll lose your fingers too. So you essentially end up trying to say, how do I achieve a compromise? And the compromises are always unsettling. They're not only unsettling to the people who are at the receiving end of the compromise, they're unsettling even to us. Because if one of the most incredible things about the United States, just like India, is that when these compromises are made, they are never made without a public debate. They are never made without vigorous dissent. And they are never made without someone feeling unhappy. Right? So the United States will go out and pursue a policy, but it's not as if all Americans have jumped behind the flag and said, wonderful, let's go for it. You'll have half the country, screaming at the administration for doing X or doing Y and so on and so forth. But, as a practical matter, you have to do what necessity demands until circumstances change. Now, of course, when you do that, you get shot at from both sides, right? Because the people that you supported and now have to jettison immediately turn around to you and, accuse you of being a fickle partner because your interests change, and so on and so forth. So there's never an easy answer to this. But if you're asking me, does the American record support the claim that it has fallen short of its ideals? The answer absolutely is yes. But I would add a complementary point, which should also never be forgotten. And that is, even as the United States is conscious of falling short of those ideals, it also reminds itself of what the ideals are. I mean, I cannot imagine a situation where US policymakers have been unaware of what their ideals would have demanded. And there is a very interesting book on this question. It doesn't deal with this question particularly, but it's a wonderful elaboration of how the United States dealt with one particular manifestation of that problem, and that is US relations with Pakistan. There is a wonderful book written by a historian called Robert McMahon, and it's called The Cold War on the Periphery, US-Pakistan relations during the Cold War. It's a book worth looking at, because you see in the history that McMahon narrates that US policymakers were constantly aware that if there were no constraints, they would not have ended up with the relationship with Pakistan that we ended up with in the 50s and the 60s. It was driven completely by the compulsions of containing the Soviet Union. And so you are making your compromises because of the circumstances that you find yourself in. As long as you don't do it blindly, that's the best you can do.
I think we will call it a day. Thank you very much, Ashley, for, I hope we haven't troubled you very much, but thank you very much, and thanks a lot for coming, and it's been a great privilege to listen to a very, very insightful and very thoughtful kind of presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.